The twin suns of the Zephyrian system hung low in the sky as light poured through the towering crystal windows of the celestial hall, casting rainbows across the marble floor where nobles gathered in glittering robes and alien emissaries watched. And solemn silence. Today was no ordinary ceremony. It was the royal wedding of Princess Serelith of the Zephyrian Empire and High Noble Varnic of House Athal. A union forged not out of love but of politics, meant to bind two powerful starfaring civilizations into lasting peace after years of Cold War, betrayal and uneasy alliances. And as the ceremonial music echoed through the hall, played by floating harmonic drones and alien instruments that sang of unity and ancient power, the princess stood at the entrance, her figure cloaked in a veil, spun from solar thread silk, her face unreadable, yet her violet eyes scanning the crowd with something close to fear, or perhaps hesitation, as though her feet resisted every forward step. Nobles whispered behind jeweled masks, envoys from distant worlds nodded approvingly, and Varnic stood at the altar in his dark uniform lined with golden thread, his face smug and cold, unaware or uncaring of the weight pressing on the young woman walking toward him. But just as the high priest raised his staff and the choir shifted into the binding hymn, a deep creak echoed across the chamber as the massive front doors began to open, something entirely unexpected since all guests had long since arrived, and all attention turned as the late arrivals stepped inside. A line of battle-scarred soldiers in dress armor from various allied species, there by tradition to honor the peace that would be sealed today, and among them, standing slightly apart as if uncertain he belonged, was a man clad in older model Alliance combat gear, faded with age and wear, his dark brown eyes alert beneath the scar on his cheek, his posture stiff but defiant. And the moment Serelith laid eyes on him, the world seemed to fall away. She stopped, breath-catching, frozen in place, as a hush fell over the grand hall, one that even the hovering drones dared not disturb, and all eyes turned between the princess and the unknown human, as tension thickened like smoke. Varnic narrowed his eyes in confusion. The emperor rose halfway from his throne, and the high priest frowned, unsure whether to proceed or pause. But then came the words that changed everything. Serelith raised her hand with a trembling grace and spoke clearly, voice ringing like crystal through the silent hall. Stop the ceremony, and the effect was instant. Panic flashing across noble faces, whispers rising like a sudden windstorm as tradition itself was defied. The high priest's staff lowered in confusion, and Varnic stepped forward, demanding an explanation. But Serelith ignored him, her eyes locked on the human soldier, who now seemed to realize he was the focus of every gaze in the galaxy. And as he stepped back out of instinct, she took one slow step forward, her veil slipping back just enough to reveal a flicker of something more than shock recognition, memory, longing, and then she said a name, soft but firm. Rhys called her, and gasps swept the crowd again, because this was no stranger, not to her, and not to those who remembered the rumors from 5 years ago during the siege of Callistra. Prime, when the princess disappeared for 7 days behind enemy lines and returned with no tale of how she survived. Now the truth hovered between them, visible in their eyes, unspoken but undeniable, and the emperor's face darkened with unease while Varnic's boiled with rage as he stepped forward and hissed, "Who is this soldier? Why does he know you?" But Sarilith did not answer him. She only took another step toward Rhys, as if each inch she moved returned her to something real, something true, and Rhys, though clearly overwhelmed, held his ground, meeting her gaze not as a subject to a sovereign, but as an equal haunted by the same memory. And in that frozen moment, the carefully arranged threads of royal strategy began to unravel. The audience forgotten, the alliance threatened, and above all else, the question surged in every mind present. What happened between the princess and this human soldier, and what would she do now that he had appeared again at the very edge of her destiny? The silence that followed Princess Sarilith's words was deep and sharp, as though the entire hall had been wrapped in glass and dropped into a frozen sea, and as she stood facing the human soldier whose name had broken the ritual Rhys called her no, one moved, not the guards, not the priests, not even Varnick, who stood stiff and furious beside the altar, his jaw tight with confusion and offense. The nobles whispered again, louder now, their curiosity burning, and Sarilith's father, Emperor Kalen, looked down from his high throne with eyes that held both surprise and fear, for there were only a few people who knew what really happened during those lost 7 days on Callister Prime, and none of them had spoken of it since. But now the soldier who had disappeared from every report and vanished into the shadows of forgotten mission stood here in the middle of a royal wedding, not by accident, but drawn by fate, and Sarilith's heart pounded as she walked toward him, slowly, carefully, ignoring the furious steps of Varnick behind her as he demanded answers she refused to give. And Rhys, for all his training and bravery, seemed unsure what to do, his hands at his sides, his face caught between duty and something deeper, something he had buried long ago. Sarilith stopped just a few feet from him and searched his face, and her voice, though quiet, was clear as she asked, "Why are you here?" And he answered after a pause, "Invitation? Diplomatic tradition," but his voice betrayed him, carrying more truth than the words alone. And the princess's expression flickered with pain, because they both knew the real reason ran deeper, wrapped in fire, blood, and a bond that neither of them had spoken aloud. The Emperor stood then, signaling the guards, but Sarilith raised her hand and said, "No one touches him," her tone calm but absolute, and the guards froze mid-step, unsure whom to obey as the room seemed to tremble under the weight of things. Unspoken, and Varnick finally reached them, his voice low and furious as he growled, "What is this, Sarilith? Some old scandal you hope to hide until after the vows?" But she didn't answer him, her eyes still locked on Rhys, and when she turned back to face the hall, her voice changed, strong and steady. "5 years ago, I was stranded during the siege of Callister Prime. I was rescued not by the Empire, not by our allies, but by a team of human soldiers who risked their lives behind enemy lines. One of them saved mine more than once," and she paused, the memories flooding backblaster fire in ruined cities, hiding in collapsed bunkers, shared rations in the dark, and conversations that meant everything when hope was almost gone. And, as she continued, "I never forgot his name, because I never forgot him." Gasps rose again, and the truth, long hidden in silence, was now as bright as the suns above. The Emperor descended the throne steps with slow, careful movements, and his voice carried across the chamber. "You returned and refused to speak of what happened. We protected your silence. Now tell me, daughter, is this the man? And She looked at Rhys once more, her answer already in her eyes, and nodded. And in that moment, the ceremony, the alliance, and the plans of every noble in the hall cracked like ice under heat, because no one had expected this. No one had planned for a soldier of Earth to reappear not just as a witness, but as a turning point. Varnick, red with anger, took another step forward and snapped. "This is treason. You would ruin an empire over a broken memory?" But Sarilith faced him now, standing tall, and said coldly, "Better a broken memory than a false future." And the tension shattered when Rhys was suddenly surrounded, not by guards, but by people from the human delegation stepping forward. To protect him, their movements subtle but ready, and it became clear that he had not come alone or unprepared. Still, he looked uncomfortable, not eager to fight or cause conflict, only to stand by the truth. And when he finally spoke again, it was with the calm of someone who had seen death and chosen to live. "I didn't come here to stop anything. I didn't even expect to see her again. But I won't lie about what happened either." And Sarilith whispered, "Neither will I." And though no orders had been given, the wedding was no longer a wedding, just a room filled with broken silence and watching eyes, and the Emperor signaled the high priest to dismiss the ceremony while Sarilith gestured for Rhys to follow her out of the chamber. Together they walked through the golden halls, silent at first, until they reached one of the palace's older towers, a quiet place hidden from most. And when she finally turned to face him, the veil now gone, she looked at him, not as royalty, but as the girl who once crouched beside him beneath a burning sky, and she asked him what she had held in her heart for years. "Why did you leave without saying goodbye?" And his face showed pain, the kind only time can dull, and he said, "Because I wasn't supposed to care, and I did. And they told me if I stayed, it would cause trouble for you. So I disappeared." And Sarilith stepped closer, voice trembling just enough to betray her control. "You were the only real thing in that entire nightmare." And he looked down, replying, "You were more than that. You were hope." And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence louder than before, filled with things neither of them could change. And as they stood in that forgotten place, it became clear that everything had changed again, not because of war, politics, or empires, but because the past had returned, and it refused to remain buried. And as distant alarms began to sound signaling unrest in the lower levels of the palace, stirred by the news already spreading, the princess and the soldier stood facing each other, knowing that what had started years ago on a ruined world was not over, and the next chapter would be written not with vows and ribbons, but with hard truths, difficult choices, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, their paths had never truly diverged. The sun was setting behind the spires of the imperial palace as Princess Sarilith stood by the window of the old tower, watching the shadows grow across the city, her thoughts tangled with questions that refused to leave her mind. And behind her, Rhys Calder remained silent, standing like a soldier who didn't know if he was still part of the mission or already a ghost lost in another time. The tension between them was thick, not of anger, but of something heavier: regret, confusion, and something that still hadn't been named. And though she wanted to ask him 100 things, her duty pressed on her shoulders like armor she could not remove, because outside this quiet tower the entire empire was already shifting. The wedding suspended, the nobles in panic, Varnick demanding answers, and her father locked in council with the highest ministers. And yet here she stood, choosing silence with a human soldier over ceremony with a noble lord, knowing every choice from here could tip the balance between peace and chaos. And still she couldn't look away from Rhys, couldn't forget the way he had shielded her under falling rubble, or how he had carried her when her leg was injured, or how he had looked at her with respect instead of fear when he finally realized who she was during the siege. And now, 5 years later, he hadn't changed much older. Perhaps rougher around the edges, but still the same man who had once helped her believe the war wouldn't break her. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, almost too calm. "They'll come for you soon." And Rhys nodded, already knowing, replying, "I didn't mean to cause all this. I was just part of the delegation. Until you stopped. Everything." And she turned, her eyes flashing not with anger, but with something else. "You didn't come here just to be part of a delegation, Rhys. Not after 5 years." And he looked away, the truth rising too fast to hold back, and said, "I came because I heard rumors about Varnick, about what he did during the war." And that made her pause, because she had heard whispers too. Things buried in classified files, fragments and reports that never made it to public view. And when she asked what he knew, he reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small crystal shard, one that glowed faint blue, the kind used by military intelligence. And he said softly, "It's not just rumors, it's proof." And she took it with trembling hands, slotting it into the old projector console in the wall. And what she saw made her stomach twist. Intercepted transmissions, secret orders, and footage showing Varnick's forces sabotaging supply routes to Callister Prime, allowing enemy fleets to strike faster, deeper, more deadly than they ever should have. All so that the ruling families of Athol could make the Empire look weak and offer peace through marriage. And it was all there, the pieces fitting too perfectly to ignore. And Serelith backed away from the console, her voice shaking for the first time. "My father. Does he know?" And Rhys nodded slowly. "I think he does. Or at least he suspects." And suddenly everything made sense. Why the wedding was rushed, why she had been kept in the dark, why Varnick had always seemed too calm, too certain of his place beside her. And now the truth felt like fire in her chest, because the marriage she was meant to complete was not a step toward peace, but a reward for betrayal. And if she went through with it, she would be helping the man who nearly caused her death gain control of her people. Outside, the city was stirring. Word of the wedding's halt had already spread. Protest chants beginning to rise in the lower districts. Ships launching from noble houses, unsure of where their loyalties should fall, and time was running out. But before she could act, the door to the tower burst open, and Imperial guards stormed in, weapons ready, armor gleaming, and their leader spoke with no emotion. Sergeant Rhys Calder is to be taken into custody by order of the High Council. And Serelith stepped forward in protest, but the guards ignored her, surrounding Rhys and locking magnetic cuffs on his wrists. And as they led him away, he looked back once, just once, and she saw in his eyes not fear, but trust, as if he knew she would not let this end in silence. And once the door slammed shut again, she stood alone in the tower, her hand still clutching the data shard, and something inside her cracked, not her strength, but the wall she had built between who she was told to be and who she truly was. She didn't return to her chambers or the throne room, but instead made her way to the private archives beneath the palace, using her mother's forgotten code to enter. And there she found what she feared: more evidence, more lies, more truths, buried to protect the image of unity. And for the first time, she realized she could no longer be the obedient daughter, the silent bride, or the symbol of peace they wanted her to be. She would have to become something else, something dangerous, something honest, something free. And as she returned to the upper halls, where the nobles now argued in small circles, and her father stood in the shadows, watching everything, she approached him. With slow steps, her voice steady. "You knew, didn't you?" And he didn't deny it, only said we needed the war to end, no matter the cost. And she whispered, "And what about the cost of the truth?" And he said, "Sometimes truth brings war." And she replied, "Sometimes silence does worse." And then she turned and walked away, past the guards, past the guests, past the masks and jewels, toward the chamber where Rhys was being held, because now she knew what she had to do, not for love, not for rebellion, but because she could not marry a lie. And whatever future came next, it would begin with a choice she would make, not as a princess, but as a leader willing to risk everything for the truth, even if it meant defying the empire she had once vowed to protect. The prison chamber beneath the palace was colder than the outer moons, a quiet, forgotten place of stone and steel, built long before the empire touched the stars. And as Rhys Calder sat chained to the wall, blood dried on his cheek from a guard's strike and his wrists raw from the cuffs, he kept his eyes closed, steadying his breath, not because he was afraid, but because he knew the game was no longer about survival. It was about time. Above him, the palace was boiling with quiet chaos. Nobles whispering, ministers meeting in secret rooms, and Varnick storming through the halls with rage barely held behind his noble mask. But Rhys thought only of her Serelith, wondering what choice she would make now that she knew the truth. And just as he started to fear she might not come, the chamber door hissed open, and light flooded the room, sharp and golden, and there she stood, cloaked in a shadow-colored robe with a datapad tucked under one arm, her face calm, but her eyes burning with something fierce and new. And as she stepped inside, the guards stiffened, but she raised her hand and said quietly, "Leave us." And though they hesitated, they obeyed, shutting the heavy door behind them, leaving her alone with the soldier who had once saved her life and might now need her to save his. Rhys looked up, lips cracking into a half-smile despite the blood, and said, "Took you long enough." And she knelt beside him, touching the cuffs gently, whispering, "I had to be sure. I had to see the rest." And he asked, "Did you?" And she nodded, pulling out the datapad and showing him the images she had found, more files, hidden records, a history of betrayal deeper than anyone expected, revealing how Varnick's family not only allowed attacks on Callister Prime, but helped fund them through secret deals with black market fleets, all to weaken the Empire and make Varnick's marriage look like salvation. Rhys listened in silence, and when she finished, she looked him in the eyes and said, "My father knew. Maybe not all of it, but enough. He thought this marriage would fix everything." And Rhys replied softly, "Some things don't need fixing. They need breaking." And Serelith stood, her voice steady. "Then let's break it." And she pulled a hidden key from her robe and unlocked his cuffs, helping him to his feet, her touch gentle but sure, and together they made their way through the servant tunnels, winding paths that only the royal bloodline knew, and with every step Serelith felt her heart harden, not with hate, but with purpose, because the empire she loved had become a place where truth was buried beneath gold, and silence, and she would no longer play her part in the lie. When they reached the council hall, hidden in shadows above the chamber, they looked down upon the gathering nobles and ministers, all seated in a circle, debating in low voices while Varnick stood at the center, his tone calm but sharp as he called for Rhys to be labeled a traitor and executed for trying to destroy a royal alliance. And Serelith waited no longer. She stepped into the light with Rhys behind her, and every head turned in shock as her voice cut through the chamber. Like a blade, the only traitor here is the one who made peace with enemies to gain a crown. And she threw the datapad onto the table, its images flickering to life in mid-air, exposing every dark secret, every transmission, every lie. And as the room exploded into shouts and gasps, Serelith stood tall, her voice louder. This wedding was built on blood and betrayal, and I will not be a part of it. And Varnick tried to speak, his words stumbling as he saw his power slipping away. But Serelith faced him and said coldly, "You let my people die. You let me nearly die, and you will never sit beside me on any throne." And her father stood, torn between pride and fear, but said nothing, watching as the council began to turn, whispers growing into demands for inquiry, for justice, for truth. And Serelith turned to the assembly and spoke one final time, her voice strong. "From this day forward, I will not be a symbol bound by duty. I will be a leader bound by truth." And as she turned and walked away, Rhys followed close behind, the guards now silent as they passed, unsure whether to stop them or salute them, and the palace behind them rang with voices rising into something louder than tradition change. But even as they left the chamber, Serelith knew it wasn't over, because exposing the truth was only the first step, and power did not fall without a fight. And as they reached the outer balcony overlooking the capital, the sky darkening with oncoming night, she asked Rhys, "What comes next?" And he looked at her, his voice low but certain, "Whatever you choose, I'll follow." And though she said nothing, her hand found his for just a second, the warmth between them stronger than the chill in the air, and as stars began to shine above them, Serelith knew that the real battle was only beginning. And this time, she wouldn't be alone. The capital was quiet before dawn, as if the city itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. And in that silence, Princess Serelith stood at the edge of the great observatory dome, watching the stars fade behind the growing light of a new day, her thoughts moving like fire across her mind, for she knew what she had started could no longer be stopped. She had exposed the truth, torn apart the wedding, and turned the council against one of its most powerful lords. But the empire was not healed, only shaken, and as her fingers traced the datapad's edge, she remembered what Rhys had told her the night before. Truth is only the spark. What you do with it lights the fire. And now that fire had to grow, because Varnick had vanished after the council meeting, slipping into the dark with his most loyal guards and ships, and reports whispered of him gathering strength in the outer sectors, calling on allies who cared more for power than peace. And Serelith could feel the pressure tightening around her like a storm about to break. Behind her, Rhys entered the dome, dressed in old military gear now cleaned and refitted, the insignia of the Human Defense Corps still shining across his shoulder, and he carried with him a message, a coded pulse transmission picked up during the night, one that showed a fleet moving toward the Athol border, ships marked not with Varnic's crest, but with an ancient symbol once banned by the Empire, the clawed son of the Red Fang mercenaries, war criminals and smugglers who had vanished after the war, and now they were answering Varnic's call, bringing with them stolen weapons, old grudges, and enough firepower to spark a rebellion. And as Sarilith studied the images, her voice was calm but heavy. If he joins with them, he'll have more than ships. He'll have fear on his side. And Rhys nodded, replying, "Then we give the people something stronger." And she looked at him, asking quietly, "What do humans have that can match an army?" And Rhys answered with a steady gaze, "Hope." And that word stayed with her as they moved quickly, activating a plan that had waited too long, because deep within the Empire, across dusty colonies and half-forgotten outposts, humans lived. Not as rulers, but as second-class citizens, used for labor, praised for loyalty, but never truly trusted. And now, with one of their own standing beside a royal who had defied the throne, everything changed. Sarilith called for an emergency summit, not with the council, but with leaders of human settlements, captains, engineers, teachers, and healers, people who had no titles but carried the weight of real strength. And when they gathered, some in person, others by holo, she stood before them not as a princess, but as someone who had seen the rot beneath the crown, and her speech was short but honest. "You were asked to bleed for a peace that was never meant for you, but I see you, and I will not build a future without you." And it was Rhys who stepped forward after, his voice not as polished, but full of truth. "They fear what we are, because they know what we can be." And something shifted in the air, a feeling like stone becoming flame. And by the time the summit ended, plans were in motion. Engineers sending schematics for shield mods, medics offering supplies, miners sending raw ore to forge new armor. And everywhere humans began to rise, not in rebellion, but in readiness, not to burn the Empire, but to rebuild it with their place finally honored. But news moved fast, and so did Varnic, launching attacks on human trade routes, framing them as rebels, using false footage to claim Sarilith had betrayed her bloodline to side with outsiders, and fear began to grow again. But Sarilith didn't hide. Instead, she went public, broadcasting a message across the galaxy from the steps of the royal palace, standing beside Rhys and dozens of humans in uniform, saying, "You can choose fear, or you can choose truth." And while some doubted her, many more listened, because the image of a royal standing shoulder to shoulder with those once cast aside was something the Empire had never seen, and it stirred something deep, something forgotten. But as support grew, so did the threat. And one night, as Sarilith met with her allies in the northern gardens, a ship broke the palace barrier, crashing into the courtyard in a blast of metal and fire. And from the smoke came attackers, mercenaries, in black armor, aiming to end the spark before it became flame. And Sarilith fought beside her guards, blaster in hand, her cloak burning at the edges as chaos roared around her. And when one mercenary cornered her near the shattered fountain, it was Rhys who dropped him with a clean shot, pulling her to cover, shouting, "They're testing our strength. Don't let them find it weak." And when the last enemy fell, Sarilith stood covered in dust and blood, looking up at the damaged palace with new resolve. because this was no longer about a broken wedding. This was a war for the soul of the empire, and she would not back down. Over the next days, her message spread wider, her allies grew stronger, and even some nobles began to shift their loyalties, afraid of being on the wrong side of history. And every time Sarilith stood to speak, Rhys was there beside her, not as her protector, but as her equal, and their bond became a symbol not of love that broke rules, but of unity that rewrote them. And across stars and cities, people began to say the name of the human soldier who stood with the princess, and in that name they found courage. The final blow came not from guns, but from truth. Sarilith released the sealed records of Varnic's crimes, every line, every order, every death, and the reaction was thunder, with entire sectors refusing his command, his ships turning away, his mercenaries scattered, and finally, the man who sought to rule through fear was left with nothing but silence, captured near the edge of space as he tried to flee, and brought back not in chains, but in quiet shame. When the trial began, Sarilith did not speak to punish him, but simply said, "This is not justice for revenge. It is justice for truth." And when the sentence was passed, it was exile, not death, for she would not let the new empire begin with more blood. As peace returned, Sarilith stood once more before her people, not in a wedding gown, but in armor of silver and blue, her crown set aside, her voice calm, saying, "Today we begin again together." And as Rhys stood beside her, the crowd roared not just for a princess or a soldier, but for what they had built together, a spark that had become a flame, and a flame that would light the future. The winds of change swept through the palace, soft but full of power, as if the very air knew something new had begun. And Princess Sarilith stood on the highest balcony of the central spire, watching the sun rise over the capital with eyes that had seen war, betrayal, and hope rise from ruin. And though the city looked the same, she could feel the difference in every sound and every face below, because for the first time in generations, people looked toward the palace not with fear or doubt, but with a quiet trust that maybe things could be better. And behind her, footsteps echoed on the smooth stone, steady and familiar, and she didn't turn as Rhys joined her, standing beside her like he always did now, his armor polished, but not for war, a symbol now of what he had helped build. And for a moment they both said nothing, watching the morning together, thinking of how far they had come since the day she stopped the wedding and everything changed. The world was rebuilding, slowly, carefully, but not without pain. Many systems had broken ties with corrupt noble houses, and some even voted to govern themselves, but instead of chaos, it brought strength, as old voices finally had room to speak, and new leaders stepped forward, chosen not by blood, but by respect. And Sarilith had refused the title of Empress when it was offered, instead forming the Council of Stars, a circle of voices from every world and every class, including humans who now held equal seats and rights after so many years in the shadows. And though not everyone agreed with her choices, enough stood behind her to protect what they were trying to build. And in the halls of power, fear of the past began to fade as trust in the future grew. But even as peace spread, danger still lingered in the dark places of space, where not all enemies wore armor, some wore smiles, waiting, watching, hoping the unity would crack, and the empire would fall back into old ways. And Sarilith knew This was the most dangerous time of all because rebuilding was harder than rebellion, and the fire of hope, once lit, had to be carefully guarded or it could die in silence. And that was why, even now, she worked day and night rewriting laws, visiting border worlds, answering questions from people who had never seen a royal before, but now saw her as one of them. It was during one of these visits to the Outer Rim colonies that word reached her of a threat that chilled even her strong heart, a signal picked up by deep space miners, carrying a language not spoken in thousands of years, one tied to the First War when the Empire was still young and the stars still untamed. And the signal repeated one name, Obsidian Crown, a lost weapon said to be buried beneath a dead world, powerful enough to destroy entire fleets with a single command, and long believed to be only legend. But the transmission was real and worse. It had been intercepted by more than one listener, including a rogue admiral who had vanished months earlier, taking a warship and half a crew loyal to Varnic's old rule. Sarilith acted fast, calling for a secret council meeting, and when the risks were made clear, she did not wait. She led the mission herself, taking only a small group of elite soldiers and scientists with Reese at her side, not just as her protector, but as her second in command, and they traveled in silence to the edge of known space, where gravity itself twisted and light bent strangely, until they reached the ghost world of Caltris, once a thriving world, now cracked open by time and war. And as they landed, the air thick with static and silence, Sarilith felt the weight of history pressing down on her, but she kept moving, through broken towers and buried halls, until they reached the core vault, sealed behind codes no one alive should have known, but the signal had carried a key, hidden in its rhythm, and when it was played back, the vault opened with a sound like thunder. Inside, the Obsidian Crown sat on a pedestal of black stone, pulsing with a light that made the air feel alive, and the scientists whispered warnings, urging them to destroy it before it could be used. But Sarilith hesitated, because something in that moment felt too controlled, too staged, and then Reese moved, stepping in front of her, eyes narrowed, weapon raised not at the crown but at one of the guards behind them, who suddenly turned and fired, revealing the truth too late. They had been followed, betrayed from within, and the rogue admiral's men burst from the shadows, weapons blazing, shouting that the crown belonged to the rightful rulers of the old empire, and chaos exploded in the vault. Sarilith fought with every ounce of her training, dodging blasts and issuing commands, while Reese shielded her from fire, returning shots with deadly aim. And the fight was brutal, close, desperate, but they held the line, and when the admiral himself arrived, armored and furious, Sarilith faced him not with fear, but with fury, demanding, "You would burn the galaxy for a ghost?" And he laughed, saying, "No, princess. I would save it from fools who believe humans belong at the throne." And that was when Reese answered with steel in his voice, "Then you don't deserve a single world." And with that, the final shot rang out, ending the fight, and the crown lay untouched on its pedestal once more. They left the world as it was, sealing the vault behind them with new codes and warning beacons, then destroyed every record of its location, because some power Sarilith realized was not meant to be used, only guarded. And as they returned to the capital, the council met again, this time in full, and voted to pass the Spark Treaty, an agreement across every world to limit weapons of ancient design and ensure that no leader, no matter their bloodline, could ever wield such force again. In the weeks that followed, the changes became real schools opened on human colonies. Border systems received new trade rights, and nobles who once ruled with fear now answered to the people. And through it all, Serelith and Rhys stood together, their bond stronger than ever, not needing titles or promises, only trust. And one day, as they walked the palace gardens in the golden light of late afternoon, Serelith asked quietly, "Do you ever wonder how it might have been if the wedding had gone on?" And Rhys smiled, answering, "We wouldn't be here." And she nodded, reaching out to take his hand. No ceremony, no crowd, just the truth between them. And as the sky above them filled with ships soaring peacefully, a voice echoed in her mind, not from the past, but from the future, a whisper of what was now possible. A kingdom not ruled by fear, but reborn in fire, forged in truth, and led by a princess who chose to change everything.